Hi, everyone. We're going to talk this week about qualitative research. A lot of the course will cover topics that are traditionally thought of as more as part of the quantitative research tradition, but it's important to consider qualitative methods early in the course because they play a role throughout the research process, and it helps us integrate both a quantitative and a qualitative perspective as we move through later topics in the course, like sampling and measurement and causation and so on. So let's take a look at what we're going to do today. We're going to look at what is qualitative research, define it. Then we're going to look at some of the various methods or sources of qualitative data, such as interviews, focus groups, case studies. And then we're going to look at how qualitative data analysis works, a bit about that, because it's a bit unique and different from quantitative data analysis or statistics, and a few ethical issues that are unique to qualitative research. Okay, so what is qualitative research? Well, one way to define it is to contrast it with quantitative research. So quantitative research uses instruments, procedures that produce quantitative measurements. It tends to turn observations into numerical data. It often involves large N, that's large samples, large N studies they're called, and the sampling tends to be random sampling. And there's a focus on variables often in quantitative research and the relationships between variables, like we saw in the week where we looked at models and theories as being sort of articulated in the form of variables and relationships. In qualitative research, the data is a different kind. It's non-numerical data, and in some ways that's probably the simplest and most accurate way to think about what qualitative research is in a general sense, is that it's research that focuses on non-numerical data, and it's often language-based data, such as texts, interviews, spoken language, images, videos, or qualitative observation. And it's a small n method, meaning a small sample method, and the samples are small often because the data collection is very intensive and more time consuming. And also the sampling tends to be purposive or theoretical sampling rather than random sampling. And then there's a focus on cases more often in qualitative research than there is a focus on variables. Although these are not hard and fast divisions, qualitative researchers also think about variables, and quantitative researchers examine cases. These are broad sort of patterns or broad distinctions that characterize the two types of studies, but there's overlap, as we'll see shortly. The social sciences have often contained a debate about qualitative and quantitative methods. The two schools of thought, in a sense, have not always coexisted very cleanly in the social sciences. There and in many disciplines, there's a debate between people, or disagreement between people who do qualitative research and quantitative research. And in a nutshell, the debate is basically that quantitative research maybe oversimplifies things. It reduces the rich detail of social life into numerical measures that are too simplistic. The criticism of the qualitative perspective is that it's not rigorous and scientific, and it involves subjective interpretation and so on. So this is a fairly long debate. It goes back to the origins of the social sciences, which began more qualitatively with more interpretive methods. There was then, around World War II, a quantitative revolution associated with advances in statistics and computing, and then there was a qualitative pushback in the 70s and 80s, beginning in that period and continuing, where people began to criticize over quantification of social research. But in many ways, these days, I think many social scientists and policy analysts and certainly applied researchers agree that both methods have advantages, that there are ways in which they work well together, that in some ways the best approach is some combination of quantitative and qualitative methods, and that's sometimes referred to as mixed methods approach or mixed methods research, which we'll try to highlight throughout this course, because in most cases it's useful to have a bit of both. And one reason for this is the notion of triangulation, that sometimes evidence is from several sources gives you a better feel for what might be real and true about a situation. So triangulation refers to the idea that several sources of data, when they converge on a finding, it offers more proof or more confirmation. Okay, there's another way in which quantitative and qualitative research fit together, and that is part of what can be thought of as a cycle of research. And this figure comes from the book, and I think it's quite useful because it illustrates the idea that for many topics, especially when the topic is fairly unknown or new, it's often good to begin with an exploratory phase of research, which tends to be mostly qualitative. So a new issue, let's say like tensions between police and the community may arise, and sometimes the first thing to do is to begin doing some interviews, on the ground observations, maybe hold some focus groups, explore the issue to understand what some of the key variables are and the key relationships. And then when you know or understand a bit more about the situation, then you're in a better position to do more systematic quantitative research, which gets us to the second phase. So we may want to expand our coverage, look at a broader population, take a more representative sample, and do a kind of quantitative survey, let's say a survey of the community. And then typically a quantitative survey, let's say, will uncover things that are not readily interpretable, or they'll suggest things that need further explanation. That then leads to sort of the possibility of, which this arrow represents, of a follow-on or follow-up qualitative investigation. So we might do some interviews or focus groups to try to shed light on what our survey finds. That may lead to some new ideas, new variables, new hypotheses, and we might revise our quantitative data collection effort, let's say if we do another community survey the next year, and so on. So that's why there's sort of a loop here at the end, that quantitative and qualitative research feed each other in a kind of sequential pattern in that way. So that's one way in which both methods are part of investigating a social problem or a social policy or a management issue, often beginning with qualitative research to understand what's going on, using that information to design a more systematic quantitative data collection effort, but then that in turn suggests new questions that may have to be investigated qualitatively. So that's the notion of a cycle of research. Okay, so let's look now at some advantages of qualitative research, because there are ways in which qualitative research fits some situations much better than quantitative research. So one of those is the notion of a theory generating question. Often in research we don't know what our theories are. We may be in an exploratory phase, and qualitative research is particularly good for developing theory, for building models and generating theory. So that's a real distinct advantage of qualitative research. Another advantage is that qualitative research is particularly useful for uncovering causal processes or mechanisms. Much quantitative research can examine relationships between variables, but remember when we talked about models and theories that there's implicit in the notion of a theory an idea of the causal process, or how an independent variable influences a dependent variable. But that's sometimes not clear just from the quantitative data. So qualitative methods are very useful for uncovering causal processes, what's going on sort of beneath the surface. Another advantage of qualitative research is its speed. It's very good for rapid, what's sometimes called rapid reconnaissance, for quickly investigating an emerging issue. There could be a disaster or a sudden conflict in a community or a sudden problem in an organization. And sometimes you need fast insight on what's going on, and that kind of rapid reconnaissance can often be done fairly well with a qualitative method, such as interviewing people or putting together a focus group quickly. Quantitative research typically takes more planning and time, and you may miss important breaking events. And just a few more advantages of qualitative research. It's good at understanding important individuals or cases. Remember, we said qualitative research focuses on cases often more than variables. It's also good for understanding groups or group dynamics. Sometimes it's easier to observe a group or group dynamics with a qualitative method, such as a focus group or through participant observation, for example. And of course, it's a better method often for analyzing cultural or visual images or texts or videos or that sort of thing, because it's in order to make sense of that kind of data, you often have to interpret the meaning of the information, and that's something that qualitative research is in a sense designed for.